but there are many other patients who presents with breathlessness, and we may not have any idea about what is the cause and how to manage. And it is also important to understand many patients towards the terminal stage becomes breathless, and we can see the suffering also. So it is important to manage this symptom very actively, so that the patient suffering can be reduced. Uh, so today's session will be taken by Dr. Raja Mayer. So she's a pulmonologist, but she has been working in palliative care for a few years, and she has been actively involved in a foundation course in palliative medicine with Pallium India. She is working in two hospitals in Mumbai, Hinduja Hospitals and Bhatia Hospital. So, welcome, madam, and it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sunil, Arun, and Rajalakshmi. Thank you for this opportunity. And I believe this group has doctors from India and overseas. So, welcome to all of you. I'm not sure how long they're doing this foundation course for. Has this been going on for? Is it the first few weeks or the last few weeks?
No, they have covered about 8 sessions.
Okay, fine. So it just is like I always, tell before I start any lecture, it's just nice to have an interactive session as best as we can in a virtual platform. So I request Dr. Sunil to keep an eye on the chat box and please feel free to interrupt so that it can be an interactive session. And I am ready to start the session if there are 21 participants. Is it okay to start the session, or do you want to wait for a couple of more minutes, Dr. Sunil?
No, we can start.
Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. Mm, One second. Okay, so just like Sunil has introduced me to you, I am a pulmonologist and very recent entrant into palliative care. And since all of you are attending this course on palliative care run by Trivandrum Pallium India, I'm sure all of you have an inkling and interest in palliative care. And the reason I actually am so interested, and now I think even more feel very strongly in the pandemic background, that all of us should have a background in palliative care. And it's not just for cancer patients, it's for all patients. In fact, I would also extend it by saying that it is not just for patients with respiratory, neurology, but also now with COVID in the looming in the background. It's extremely important to be aware of what we can do for patients who have symptoms of respiratory diseases during these times. So palliative care is extremely important as a branch of medicine for all specialities. So what we will cover today in the 40 minutes or so allotted to me is the need for palliative care in respiratory medicine. Second is, what is chronic breathlessness syndrome? Again, a very important fact in the COVID pandemic, because a lot of our patients are very breathless, and despite being on the maximum treatment, they do complain of breathlessness. The other thing that we will touch upon is the use of morphine. Again, it is a topic which is not taught to us during our MBBS and our MD, and most doctors and healthcare professionals are oblivious to the wonderful benefits of morphine. So that's something that we would touch the topic, because even if people have heard and they are using morphine, they probably don't use morphine for breathlessness as much as they do for pain. So it's important to have a discussion on this, and also just briefly run past the palliative care approach to other respiratory symptoms. This is what we hope to cover today. So, why do we need to talk of palliative care in respiratory medicine? So, historically, all of you must have heard in your general introductory lecture in palliative care that historically it was started for cancer patients, and it was meant for cancer patients, especially in the advanced stages of cancer. So, in Europe, when the movement for palliative care started in the late 60s, by Dame Cicely Saunders, it was predominantly focused on cancer patients. However, over the years, this thought process has changed. And now, if you see the amount of Indians affected by other various conditions, for example, this data published sometime in the year 2016 and out in the news in 2017 shows us that tuberculosis, respiratory diseases, hepatitis, diabetes, heart disease, stroke form a bulk of Indians who get affected by these conditions. And if you see in cancer, yes, 1 million Indians are diagnosed every year for cancer, and but it does not form the chunk of the illnesses that affects the people of India. So, and if you focus on this non-cancer, non-communicable diseases, a large amount of Indians are affected by it. Also, if you recollect that these conditions are diagnosed fairly early and people live with these conditions like heart disease, like diabetes, like COPD for a long period of time. So the importance that we need to actually focus upon is that a lot of the country is affected by other conditions other than cancer. A lot of the non-cancer conditions, patients live for a prolonged period of time with a high symptom burden. And just to highlight certain statistics, India has the 18% of the world's population and almost double number of Indians, the 32% of Indians actually suffer from chronic respiratory diseases. So the burden of respiratory disease in India is very, very high. We share 1/3 of the global burden of chronic respiratory diseases. And therefore, also the disability, daily disability allowance also is much higher than the rest of the world. This is also compounded by the fact that we have a slowly aging population, especially in India. So now it's a younger population, but in about 30 years, you're expected to have a 300% rise in 60-year-olds and a 700% rise in the 80-year-olds. So please do remember that these patients are going to suffer from illnesses which will contribute to their worsening of their respiratory diseases. And in terms of numbers, the most common symptom that we see in respiratory disease is breathlessness. And breathlessness need not necessarily be only original because of the lung. It could be a cardiac, it could be a general debility that we see in cancer, like anorexia and cachexia. So, multiple causes attribute to breathlessness. Also, neurological conditions can lead to breathlessness. So, annually, about 75 million people worldwide suffer breathlessness, of which, if you see the statistics, more than 90% of the 65 million are with respiratory illnesses, 50% of those with the incurable cancers, and 50% of the 23 million with cardiac disease. So, breathlessness shouldn't only make you think of the lung, there are other causes also of breathlessness. So, just to list you the causes of breathlessness, it could be the airways, which is like COPD, even bronchial asthma. Two is parenchymal conditions like interstitial lung disease. Three is, for example, very severe, large, massive pleural effusions can cause. So in any time when you need to think of causes of a particular symptom in the lung, it's best to divide it into airway, parenchymal, mediastinal, vascular, and then you can put on the causes. So if you go by that way, so even for example, airway will include bronchiectasis, COPD, asthma. Parenchymal will include interstitial lung disease, massive pneumothorax, massive pleural effusions, as well as pulmonary embolism can also result in breathlessness. But you must remember that what we are talking about is those patients who are chronically breathless. Because today, what we are going to talk about is the palliative care approach of respiratory symptoms. So, chronic recurrent congestive heart failure, those patients with neurodegenerative conditions like motor neuron disease, advanced malignancies, and the anorexia cachexia syndrome, these are the ones that can contribute to chronic breathlessness. So, coming back to this important graph, which I'm sure all of you must have seen over the past 8 sessions, this is just to roughly describe how people are dying in the world. And if you see that sudden death is less than 10%, which means only one amongst the 10 of us will die suddenly, the rest of the nine out will have a bed bound phase, which shows that people will require palliative care more and more because modern medicine just doesn't let us die quickly. Plus, even if you see, sudden deaths happen mostly under the age of 50, never above the age of 50. And of the other kind of ways or methods in which people die, one, of course, is the terminal illness, which can be akin to cancer, where patient, which is graph B, where patient leads a good quality of life for some time and then there's a sudden dip. But the bulk of the population fits into category C and category D graph, where people with organ failure, so chronic renal disease, chronic neurological conditions, cardiac conditions, and respiratory conditions, where there's a slow dip of there is a slow dip of quality of life of these patients, and these patients will never achieve the original quality of life. Each acute exacerbation could have been death, but modern medicine pushes them up. And therefore, for a long period of time, they suffer a very high symptom burden. So, this could be explained by, say, a COPD. He's diagnosed at the age of 60, and then every acute exacerbation makes him more and more frail, and eventually he probably dies 10 to 15 to 20 years later. And throughout this journey, he has suffered not just physically, emotionally, financially, socially, vocationally. In fact, there are many reports suggest that respiratory patients who are chronically ill, they die a social death before a physical one. So if you can imagine the life of a patient with COPD or interstitial lung disease, they slowly die without any support, without any support for their family, without any support for them. This is why we need palliative care in these patients for seeing to it that the journey is made bearable. And the last, which is again commonly seen in elderly people or with patients with dementia. So we have patients who can live up to 10 years after being diagnosed with dementia. And I don't know how many of you have experienced having elderly people or friends, parents with dementia, but it can be extremely a distressing situation for people at home to be caregivers for dementia patient and for these patients to keep having a lingering slow death. And these are the two categories of people which definitely require the support of palliative care. Any questions, Sunil? Do you want me to stop, or anybody wants to share something?
There are no questions till now, but if
Yes.
there is any questions from participants, if you have anything to clarify, please ask.
So everybody is clear till now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. So going ahead to tell you just in a rough idea of how once a patient comes to you with breathlessness, how should you process and how should you assess the breathlessness? So in order to understand the assessment of breathlessness, you broadly categorize breathlessness into acute, acute on chronic, and chronic. So acute breathlessness is something obviously not in the purview of today's topic, but acute on chronic and chronic is something that we do deal constantly. Like I said, patients with congestive cardiac failure or patients with chronic obstructive lung disease. These are the kind of patients who are chronically breathless. And at times when they get an infection or an exacerbation, they become breathless, acute or chronic. So it's important to understand the etiology and therefore the duration of the breathlessness in order to help the patient. And the various scales of breathlessness is something that you have already learned in MBBS. So I'm just going to go through it just to remind you that in the Heart Association, New York Heart Association
Can I
classifies.
interrupt you for a minute?
Yes.
Dr. Edward was asking in COVID,
Yes.
what type of graph will be the one?
Okay, very
Yeah.
interesting question. So you in COVID now, from our experience of 6 months, what we have noticed is that there is a sudden dip in the patient's condition. Suppose the patient has been admitted in a hospital, and there are patients who have been doing well and they're suddenly dipped, like we have seen in patients with microangiopathy. So those patients come with clot and they suddenly dip and die, or they become so sick that we need to ventilate them. But the other group of patients that we are now seeing fit into category C, where may not be over years, but over weeks, these patients come out of the ventilator, but because of the fulminant acute fibrosis, these patients are not able to maintain their oxygen saturation. They are in ICU with on 12 and 15 liters of oxygen, and eventually they, despite all the treatment, they die. So something like what happened to one of our famous singers in India, which is who just recently passed away, Mr. S.P. Balasubramaniam. So he was admitted in August 5th, and actually there are videos of him from the hospital that he was doing well. Then he dipped and he had a obviously was on a ventilator for a very long time, and then what he actually died of was fibrosis and a persistent respiratory failure. So we are seeing two kinds of trajectories of death with COVID, some who go quickly and some who linger and linger, like stage 3, but may not necessarily be over years. What we are seeing is over weeks, because the fibrosis is very, very fulminant. Does that answer the question, Sunil?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is one more question.
Sure.
Is COVID patient always be palliative patient?
Not at all. So this is exactly why we need to all of us as doctors, more so in the pandemic, need to have an understanding of palliative care. So you know exactly when to apply the principles of palliative care. So COVID patients are, it's not that COVID is incurable, first of all. Everything about COVID is new. So we are also on the learning process. The third thing, every passing month and more patients we see, we are getting more and more confident. So as of today, the statistics does show that the recovery rate has improved, and that the total number of cases in India is slowly dropping. Having said that, it's not that all patients of COVID are palliative. When does this thing happen? Is when you have, why is it important to discuss palliative care during COVID? Is because of the volume of patients all at the same time. Any healthcare system is overwhelmed. So very often you have few ventilators and many more patients. That is where you need to bring your ethical judgment, your decision-making ethical judgment into whom you're going to give aggressive treatment. And suppose you have an elderly patient who has multiple comorbidities, those patients should be triaged to take of comfort care. The important part here, of course, is communication. You need to understand the values and beliefs of the patient. Second, where you apply palliative care principles. So first is when you need to triage and to choose patients for aggressive treatment. Once you have put the patient on an aggressive treatment and put him on remdesivir and steroids and prone position, artificial ventilation, then you can give the patient a full chance to survive. If the patient survives, then you must rehabilitate those patients. But there have been many patients with a huge cytokine storm whom we are not able to survive. And there have been relatives after 4 and 6 weeks of invasive therapy asked us, can't we do something else for our patient? And then the question of withdrawing care also comes in. So it's extremely important. For example, I've had a patient recently, young 54-year-old, who came very breathless, who was put on a ventilator, whose x-rays improved. He was weaned off the ventilator, but he never woke up. And on doing the CT of this head, we realized as a part of the complication of the microangiopathy due to COVID, he had a huge bleed in his head. And that was the reason he was in deep coma. And that family, when spoken to, that it might be very unlikely that he will wake up to lead a normal life, requested withdrawal of care. And that was where the palliative care angle of COVID treatment comes. So it's not that all patients of COVID are palliative. Is that also clear? Sunil?
Yeah. Another question is the fibrosis more common in elderly patients?
uh, what kind of fibrosis? Interstitial lung disease or interstitial fibrosis is not something that is seen for in all elderly. No. What you can see is certain scars of old healed infection. That is not progressive pulmonary fibrosis. Interstitial lung disease is a different category of illness, and interstitial lung disease can be due to multiple reasons, from occupation to medications to reflux, gastric reflux, to idiopathic. So there are multiple causes. What you see in elderly could be scarring due to previous infection. Not all elderly have fibrosis.
I think this question was on COVID causing fibrosis.
COVID patients, again, now COVID patients, the way it affects the lung is by acute fibrosis. And this fibrosis, unfortunately, progresses very fast to cause respiratory failure and which is incompatible with life. So it's not that it is seen in elderly. In fact, it is seen more with people with a stronger cytokine storm. So more the cytokine storm, more the inflammation, and more the lung heals by fibrosis. Is that clear?
Yeah, thank you.
Anything more?
There are a few more. One thing which you have already answered, pulmonary fibrosis is acute in case of COVID.
COVID is acute, but otherwise it could. So there are different kinds of fibrosis. So there's something called as Heman-Rich syndrome, which is basically what do you say, fulminant pulmonary fibrosis, where some patients are diagnosed in March and they are dead in September. We don't know why certain people get idiopathic fibrosis and they progress really rapid. But most of the times, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis progresses over 2.5 to 5 years. And that's when, towards the end of most patients, it's like some cancers where we don't have any treatment and we only treat the symptoms. And we try to now delay the fibrosis by antifibrotics. But even then, there are some patients with still progress. So usually the pulmonary fibrosis we see are over 2.5 to 5 years. The ones associated with connective tissue, the ones associated with sarcoid, those are usually 2.5 to 5 years. Some don't progress at all. There are some other kinds of interstitial pneumonias which do not progress. But in COVID, it is seen to rapidly progressive fibrosis, which seems to be the cause of death in many patients. And that's also probably why SPB died, was despite him coming out of the ventilator, he probably had fulminant fibrosis that led to his death. Good to proceed.
So one more question.
Yes.
Is dexamethasone or methylprednisolone is better?
So we usually start on methylpred. Dexa is usually, I think, given more for the brain and for life-threatening like spinal canal stenosis or edema in the brain. In the lung, we usually use methylprednisolone bolus doses, and oral is Visolone. So, for example, some of the COVID patients who are home quarantined, we tell them to monitor their blood saturation. If their saturation dips or they have worsening of breathlessness, we tell them to start the Visolone and get to a hospital. So it tides over the crisis.
Will it avoid fibrosis?
So the aim is to avoid because the kind of inflammation that COVID produces is ground glass inflammation. And as you know, steroid is a potent anti-inflammatory drug. So the aim is to decrease the inflammation rapidly, therefore in hope of preventing fibrosis. It's not necessary that it will prevent fibrosis because it's not an anti-fibrotic, it's an anti-inflammatory. The hope is to prevent that.
We can,
and the hope is also to keep the patient alive by giving the fibrosis, because you're attacking the inflammation. There's so much of inflammation response, and by giving steroids, you want to cut that inflammation at its bud.
Okay, we can move forward.
Yeah. So just to tell you the classification according to the New York Heart Association, for the heart is class 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm sure you can read out all this on your own. It's not a problem. But what we use as respiratory physician is grades, and it is a modified medical research council grading, and this is also based on how much the patient can do in compared to people of his own age, height, race, and sex. So this is also something that is self-explanatory. Now, when we have a patient of breathlessness, what we actually do to evaluate is obviously a detailed history. It is very important to evaluate the patient in with the history taking, because this gives you the etiology of the breathlessness, the duration of the breathlessness, and then other associated features can actually help you decide whether there is smoking related disease or whether there's a connective tissue disease. So nothing can beat a detailed history. Second thing, of course, is clinical examination, which unfortunately has taken a big hit because of COVID. We are not able to see all our patients, but even then, we use the help of GPs and family doctors who are doing home visits. But as specialists now, a lot of my patients I end up seeing by teleconsultation. But clinical examination, again, very important. The investigations we do in the order is chest x-ray, and we also now in COVID is CT scan, because CT scan picks up subtle conditions which can prove to be COVID. Then the other things we do is ECG, because breathlessness can be due to the heart, echo, and in order to be more clearer to the origin and the etiology of the breathlessness, a lung function test. Unfortunately, I feel that's not used very well. It must be incorporated whenever possible, as well as an arterial blood gas, because arterial blood gas then tells you whether it's a type 1 respiratory failure or type 2 respiratory failure. And what is the meaning of type 1 and type 2? Type 1 is where there's pure oxygen, which is, only when oxygen is limited, is not normal. So when the partial pressures of oxygen in the ABG is low, it is type 1 respiratory failure with normal carbon dioxide. When the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is low with a high carbon dioxide, it is type 2. Another way to remember is type 1 respiratory failure, the causes are lung. Type 2 respiratory, the causes is the pump, because you can have signals coming from the brain which is affected right to the chest. So chest wall, motor neuron disease, stroke, all this can cause type 2 respiratory failure. So is that clear? So investigations is important, and you must do pulmonary function tests more often than we normally see these days. Unfortunately, again, PFT is not commonly done because of the COVID fear, because patient has to blow out into the chest, into the machine, and the technician is also at risk. So a lot of people are not able to do PFT. But when we are, back, hopefully in the next year or so, PFT is an important tool to diagnose breathlessness. So, when I trained to be a pulmonologist, I never thought of breathlessness beyond what I saw. So when the patient complained of breathlessness, I asked him duration, I asked him what makes him feel better, I asked him what makes him feel worse, but I never went beyond that. And that is what palliative care has taught me, because when a patient is so breathless that he's not able to walk independently, he's not able to finish full sentences, there are lots of psychosocial impact because of the breathlessness. It obviously limits the activity of daily living. He's obviously more and more dependent for a shower, for a bath, for going to the toilet. He's not able to go to work. Therefore, he loses the role in the family. He's the one who is dependent on others in every way, physically, emotionally, mentally. People his age are also old. He's not able to go out and meet his friends socially. So there's a lot of psychosocial aspects that these patients develop. And therefore, these patients are frustrated, they're angry, very often in low mood, and they're constantly in fear of death and anxious. It's very normal. So if I ask all of you to sit back and take a deep breath in and only breathe out half, and then from that breathe in again and breathe half, that is the way our patients feel 24 by 7, 365 days a year. So do you all want to try that exercise where you take a deep breath in, breathe out half, try to breathe in again from there, and breathe out half. So imagine your lung capacity is so less because of the anatomical destruction of the lung, that the amount of air that is going into every breath is lesser and lesser, and the patient is chronically feeling this kind of breathless 24 by 7. It's like you being on a treadmill at 6 or 7 or 8 for 20 minutes. How you feel breathless, that's the kind the patients feel 24/7, 365 days. And imagine the impact it has on its life. And that is beautifully described in this model which I discovered only after coming into palliative care. Once you start getting breathless, you obviously, the work of breathing is more, your respiratory rate is more, and you're using all your accessory muscles of respiration. This triggers anxiety. And then you start thinking about death, about doom, about, you get more and more panicky. Because of this, you start moving less, you start walking less, and therefore there is more and more deconditioning. By what? By this I mean, if you use your muscles less, you will lose your muscles. So therefore, once you lose these muscles, next time you're doing even a simple task, that gets you even more breathless. So all our patients who are chronically breathless are stuck in this vicious cycle. And that is why palliative care is extremely, extremely important. Any questions, Sunil? I can see some couple of chats.
No, there are no questions.
Okay. Somebody wants to do exercise, we will do that again. It is important because I think, that's another very important aspect of palliative care is empathy. And unless we know what the patient is going through, we will never realize how distressing it is for them. So coming back to this breathing, thinking, functioning model, it is very important for us as palliative care physicians to break this cycle because our patients are getting stuck in this rut. And how can we do that? So that is what we are going to see. So this is where you need to understand the meaning of this chronic breathlessness syndrome, which was defined by Miriam Johnson from England. Now, what is chronic breathlessness syndrome? So this is a condition described for all those patients of ours who are on maximum optimum treatment for their underlying condition. So for COPD, for ILD, they're already taking maximum treatment and still they continue to be breathless. And this breathlessness contributes and impacts their life directly, affecting their psychosocial and other limitations. So it's not important if the patient is breathless for 2 years, 2 months, but these patients are severely depressed and it affects their mental health status. So it is therefore important for us to identify these patients of chronic breathlessness syndrome and help them. Help them how? First of all is the non-pharmacological conditions. So what all can we teach them? We teach them to position themselves. We teach them to sit in a well-ventilated room. We tell them to sit next to a window if possible, to wear loose clothes. In the pre-COVID area, a fan blowing onto the face was considered very, very effective. And still in those patients who are COVID negative, who can be used because it gives a sense of relief. Also, these patients can be taught certain breathing exercises to feel relaxed. So physiotherapy, rehabilitation, pulmonary rehabilitation, extremely, extremely important, as important as your pharmacological treatment. So please realize that even patients, caregivers can be taught these simple things of distraction, of maybe massage, of maybe acupressure, of acupuncture, of positioning, of breathing. So all these things can be taught to patients' relatives even at home. Coming to the pharmacological, you all know for different conditions, we use different medications. So for airway, it is mainly steroids, nebulizer, oxygen, and bronchodilators, antifibrotics, antifibrotics for interstitial lung disease. Of course, we can also use the treatment with non-invasive ventilation at home, where we can make the patient feel less breathless. But the one thing that helps patients immensely is low dose, safely titrated morphine. And in Bombay, we do not get sustained release, we get only immediate release. So, immediate release low dose morphine is extremely helpful in the treatment of chronic breathlessness syndrome when our patients are already taking maximum optimal treatment for their underlying condition. Any questions or any comments before I move on to the wonders of morphine? So again, I would like to emphasize here that we are not trained about morphine. We are not taught in our I was not taught in undergraduate and postgraduate. So as doctors and particularly as pulmonary physicians, we are scared of using morphine for breathlessness. But it is very, very important to remember that the doses used in respiratory medicine is not as that in pain. Secondly, we do not start with every 4 hours. We start with start low, go slow, which is the mantra in palliative care. We only give that much which the patient is relieved with. So there is no fixed dose. So there is no fixed dose of how much we should give. Every patient, it is different. You need to titrate it to the level that the patient reaches. And what does morphine do? It reduces the ventilatory response. It decreases the hypoxia. It decreases the work-related work of
Alarm at
breathing.
5 minutes. Alexa, alarm at.
Sorry, somebody is speaking.
I request Dr. Uma to stay muted. Dr. Rajam, you can continue.
Yeah. So what does morphine do? It decreases the sensation of breathlessness. It doesn't do anything to the lung. It's very, very important to explain that to the patient that it is not a cure for his underlying illness. It is just to improve the quality of life and to give him comfort care. And therefore, it decreases the work of breathing. And in the 4 years that I have used morphine as a palliative care physician, I haven't seen deaths due to morphine induced respiratory depression or worsening of hypercapnia. You're not stopping all the medications, you're continuing all the medications, and you're adding morphine so that the patient feels less breathless. Because what morphine makes them do is take a bath easily, or walk to the dining table and eat with the rest of the family, or able to talk to his friend on the phone more comfortably. So these are small things that make a huge difference for those patients whose quality of life is really, really bad because of the persistent breathlessness. And we go very, very slow, only increase by 25% per week when there is a change or improvement. And please remember, whenever you start morphine, you must give an antiemetic because morphine causes nausea. And you must always prescribe a laxative because these are a population of patients whom we cannot afford to be constipated. These patients cannot afford to push for stools. So you must prescribe laxatives and you must prescribe antiemetic in the first 3-4 days till they get used to this. So this is a flow chart which is easy for you to follow, simple as to how we start the morphine in morphine naive patients, opioid naive patients, and in otherwise. And if you feel that the patient has a lot of anxiety associated with the breathlessness, how to add a benzodiazepine or a lorazepam and how to monitor these patients. Any questions? Any?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there were question on do we use oral morphine or IV morphine?
So
And
most of my patients are taking oral who can swallow. We give them oral. Very rarely we use intravenous. We use in palliative care we use subcutaneous approach, especially if patient is towards actively dying or terminally ill. But most of my patients actually have been on are on oral morphine at home, and they take it for probably almost 8 or 9 months before they pass away. At least what we managed to do is we able to improve their quality of life slightly, give them certain joys of life, even if you're not able to cure the illness.
so Dr. Edward says he used bolus dose of 2 milligram IV in COVID patients.
Yeah, for morphine.
Yeah.
Yes, correct. So those are the patients who are in so much distress, and I'm sure already are on high flow oxygen, remdesivir, steroids, in everything, and still they're breathless. And yes, you can use it, but I would still appreciate it if we'd still start low, go slow. So 2 milligrams is fair enough because you dilute the 2 milligrams. I mean, the way we use it is 1 milligram of morphine is diluted so that every ml has 1 milligram. So 2 milligrams at a time, Sunil, is quite reasonable, I think, for those patients who are acutely distressed.
So Dr. Juvaria has a personal question. Dr. Juvaria?
Yeah, hi, ma'am. Yeah, I had written it. I don't know if it's the right time to ask or should I ask after the session?
It's okay if you want to ask, we can ask it right now, whatever suits you.
Okay. So, ma'am, I've been having this issue of getting out of breath and breathing heavily, and sometimes getting out of breath since many years while climbing or walking briskly. So there's no underlying pathology. I'm a dentist, ma'am. I've shown it to few doctors, but they say that it's everything else is normal. So
So I just have two questions, if you don't mind me asking. Are you used to doing regular exercise?
not very regular, ma'am. Yeah.
See, sometimes this could be because of deconditioning. So if you're not used to climbing stairs regularly, and if you do it, suppose tomorrow you ask me to run a marathon, even I will faint. So your body needs to get trained to the exercise to so that your body doesn't feel breathless. That is one.
Okay.
Two, you should also check things like anemia and other issues which are common in young women. So therefore, that also could contribute to the breathlessness.
Ma'am, there's nothing, no underlying.
So exercise is something you should do proper graded exercise. I'm like, for example, I'm not saying start exercising 1 hour a day. Build it up and include climbing stairs, include walking uphill. So your body gets used to doing that.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Should I
So-
go on? Yeah.
There is another question: how to differentiate between anxiety and panic?
So this is a very difficult question in the sense, suppose, for example, you have a patient who is breathless and you have obviously given him all his medications and you have tried all the non-pharmacological, and then you need to start exploring why, what is there something else that's bothering you? Are you worried about something? So if the patient starts telling you, then you know that he's also anxious. My daughter is not got married, or what will happen to my family after this. So you need to have a holistic approach to breathlessness. Now, despite the treatment with morphine, or despite taking, if the patient breaks out to panic is obviously a extreme situation of anxiety where there are other parameters like pulse rate goes up, like the patient is breaking into a sweat, he's being unreasonable. So there is a definite difference between anxiety and panic. Sunil, would you want to add on to that?
So panic attacks comes on suddenly, and as you told, it will be intense, and often there will be overwhelming fear. But anxiety also, it may be chronic. So the culmination, if the patient is already anxious, and sometime they will be suddenly becomes breathless. So in such instances, that will be maybe the person have seen somebody is dying nearby on the bed. So they will feel certain anxiety, and that will lead to intense breathlessness.
Correct.
And
So it's a
that,
spectrum of anxiety. Like Sunil was saying, anxiety could be underlying and chronic for a very long. When it's a sudden expression of anxiety and it's a burst of fear, then the patient is in a panic mode. And where the reason we need to differentiate is that panic attacks need to be acutely controlled. So you give a little larger dose of the benzodiazepine and you will give a longer acting benzodiazepine so that patient is controlled better. Yeah, Sunil, anything?
no, madam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so this chart, this presentation, even Rajalakshmi has, so she can share it with you. There's absolutely no problem. Please always remember about the antiemetic, and always remember about the laxative, and always remember, start low, go slow. Talk to your patients. They shouldn't think that this is a magic wand and they will be fine and they'll be cured. Please remember that we use morphine in those patients who have already had a long stint with their breathlessness. They're already on maximum doses. They are the ones who have chronic irreversible respiratory conditions. So these are not used as first line treatments, but they are for patients who already have something which has been there for a long time, and it's an irreversible respiratory condition. So this is another important thing that I faced.
Madam.
Yeah.
I think in the previous slide there was a mistake, maybe during the I don't know, the opioid plus longer acting benzodiazepine. Example is midazolam. Midazolam is short acting benzodiazepine.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah,
No,
that was, yeah.
Correct. Yeah. No. It's opioid. So they're saying opioid plus medium acting for anxiety, and for dyspnea and panic, you can give midazolam. That long acting benzodiazepine is a mistake. Correct. Sorry about that. Thanks, Sunil. Okay, so we need to deal with the phobia that morphine has. So lots of patients also feel giving morphine is end of life. Giving morphine is addiction. They don't mind suffering the breathlessness, but they won't get addicted to it. They say, I don't have pain, I don't have cancer. So these are the things that we need to train ourselves, that it is not just meant for pain, it is also meant for breathlessness. Second thing, those patients whom we give indicated morphine, so those patients who are in pain and those patients who are chronically breathless, the morphine that we give is needed, so the patient does not get addicted to it, because it attaches itself to the available mu receptors. So it is unindicated morphine that makes you addicted. It is not given in indication. So that is very important to remember. We need to remove our phobia so that we are able to convince our patients, and patients really do very, very well. So it's a wonder drug, especially for patients who are not able to do anything. Please look up references. There is multiple, and I'm sure even Pallium India can share, but this is one such where there is a great benefit of oral steroids, and there is no instance where the carbon dioxide rises or the pH saturation or oxygen partial pressure falls. So it can be used safely. The most important thing is, once you prescribe, you should review the patients weekly and see how the patient has improved. So therefore, some patients of mine stop taking it because of the constipation. Some patients are still scared about the addiction, or some patients are taking it like every 2 hours. So you need to regulate that, because the maximum dose we give in patients who are breathless is up to 30 milligrams. So it's not like, unlike in pain where there is no ceiling dose, there is a rough cutoff of 30 milligrams in patients who are chronically breathless. So it's also an extremely useful drug, like I said, was mentioned before, in terminal breathlessness, where the patient is actively dying and literally struggling like a fish out of water. You can use it in combination with midazolam as well as haloperidol if the patient is in delirium, and you use a subcutaneous route. You can give it a continuous injection, and this patient, it's very, very comforting to see patients die with dignity, peace, and hardly any suffering. So that is our whole aim of palliative care, where when we can't cure, we should be able to comfort and care for the patient and the relatives. Because if the patient is comfortable, the family also gets comfortable. So we can use morphine very, very effectively in treatment of chronic breathlessness. Yeah, how are we going for time?
It's okay, madam, because we are discussing in between. So
Okay, so this is another sorry.
May I just ask a question in your previous slide? If
Sure.
that's okay. There was that sentence saying innate patients morphine 10 mg plus midas 10 mg subcut over 24 hours.
Yes.
How frequently are you giving this? Are we giving this?
So this is, so if what we do is we have a syringe driver, we put the morphine and the midazolam in a normal pint of, say, normal saline, or because these patients are terminally breathless, they're actively
500
dying
ml.
patients.
500 ml of normal saline.
Correct. And that you give over 24 hours.
Subcutaneously, as an infusion.
As an infusion.
Okay.
Correct. So this can be changed every 24 hours, and this usually doesn't last for 2 or 3. Maximum it lasts for is 2 days, because these patients are actively dying patients.
They're at the end of their life, basically.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, that's true. So we give it, and that is what is also therefore there is a little bit of a debate about palliative sedation. They say that you should not be using this term. There is because if you aggressively control the patient's symptoms, then there isn't a necessity for palliative sedation. But there is a group in Europe which actively uses this term as palliative sedation, because ethically you need to explain to the family that this patient is now going to be sedated and will not wake up. So you need to document this very clearly, that this patient might not wake up at all, will die in his sleep, because as it is, his body is packing up. All we are doing is managing his distressing symptoms. Because sometimes what has happened is, you give the injections, the patient died because of the injection. The patient was anyway going to die. The condition was anyway so bad. What we are doing is giving minimal dose to achieve comfort and see to it that we maintain the patient's dignity and keep the family also. It's very difficult to watch a patient distressing and so
True.
breathless. So that is the whole idea of palliative sedation. Is that clear?
Yeah, so that is palliative sedation that we're giving, that
Yeah.
morphine.
So some people say it should not be called palliative sedation, but essentially it is aggressive method of controlling distressing symptoms.
Okay, thank
And
you.
in breathlessness, you use it with a combination of midazolam. If the patient is delirious, you can also add haloperidol to the same concoction and give a drip. So sometimes, very often, we are not able to find a syringe driver, not everywhere. So what we do is use a scalp vein and we count the drops. So we give very slowly, about 60 micro drops per minute over the 24 hours.
Okay.
Because the point is, what can be argued is if we give a little larger dose, then maybe we are actively doing something to hasten death. Correct? But the
Right.
whole focus is that we are not hastening death. We are not God. Do not believe in euthanasia. We only want to give the dose that causes max. So you can start low also. Even in that subcutaneous infusion, you can do 5 milligrams and then slowly increase the doses also. That is also allowed. But if you want to achieve comfort, you can give 10 milligrams in 24 hours, which is a very little dose.
Okay.
Yeah.
These are patients that you don't want to intubate or ventilate because, I mean, you should
Palliative care. So these are patients. So for example, you have a 80-year-old COPD. He's been bed bound, house bound, oxygen bound, BiPAP bound. He comes in with a pneumothorax, or he comes in, say, with a massive infection. You treat the infection, you treat the antibiotics. He goes into type 2 respiratory failure. They're very clear they don't want to intubate. You put the NIV. You can continue the nebulizer. You continue the Derifilin. You continue steroids, but still the patient is breathless. Then you can give a slow dose of morphine.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Or ILD patients. So similar situation where they have, and that's the reason why in respiratory medicine, because these patients are there with you for a long time, you need to start asking questions about advanced care plan. What do you want us to do in an emergency? Because autonomy is the first principle of medical ethics.
Right.
We never indulge in that conversation with patients because death and dying is another conversation that is never encouraged in medical school. We are only curing lives and we only save lives. We never talk about death and dying in med school. And death and dying is considered as a failure, right? Like even in when we did ICU duties, we used to say this patient should not die on my duty, and it's almost like as if it's a failure. How can this happen in my duty?
True. Yeah, I know.
So this concept has to change because we need to accept, especially in patients who have lingered with their symptoms, who are at the end of life, we still want to medicalize death.
Yes.
So that is something we need to unlearn.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So therefore, then the other distressing thing very commonly seen in patients with respiratory diseases is secretions. So very often we see patients with stroke or patients with, who have just come out of the ICU. People constantly use suction. And suction can be extremely traumatizing, especially in an awake patient. Even in a semi-comatose patient, the patient kind of chokes on that rubber tube. So we need to do something in palliative care settings of how to decrease the secretions. And the medications available to us are hyoscine hydrobromide, the simple Buscopan, or glycopyrrolate. So details and the pharmacological details are available in most of your text. But the important thing here is not to suction the patient and cause him more discomfort, decrease the secretions, give him the nebulizer, give him the position change. Sometimes just overhydration can be causing the secretions. So look at what you're doing, and then you can use hyoscine and glycopyrrolate in order to take care of the distressing symptoms that very often is noticed in patients who are in the approaching towards the end of life. Okay, so very, very important to realize that the whole purpose of palliative care is to give comfort to the patient and care for the relatives as well as the patient. After you have tried all your aggressive treatment, you can use these certain medication, tweak your normal medications in such a way that it causes comfort to the patient. And I have noticed very often that patients and family find it easier to withhold treatment than withdraw treatment. I'm sure you'll have a class on ethics and law, but it is important either which way to communicate well, to communicate sensitively, and to document. And after doing all this, you have to be there for the patient and the family to support them through this difficult decision because they have to live with this decision for the rest of their life. So if there's nothing, I can go on to the next symptom because I think I'm already running late. Sunil?
Yeah, we can have 10 minutes more.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll just run through this because I don't think it is important. Cough especially is important because I think it forms a probably commonest symptom in the outpatient clinic, and it can be very distressing and affect sleep, and again alter your activities of daily living and give you certain difficult complications like rib fracture, incontinence, syncope, etc. So again, cough is not essentially only with the lung. It can be the lung, the reflux cough because of the gastric reflux, cardiac conditions, certain drugs, radiation induced cough, as well as psychogenic cough. So again, history taking is important, and exploring and noticing the patients with cough is important. So most important thing that you need to remember is, again, if you do not have an etiology for cough, for example, a lot of our COPD patients, a lot of our ILD patients have dry, hacking, refractory cough. So you treat them with all the medications. So simple things, again, very, very important. You must ask them to eat early, eat light, lifestyle changes, propped up position. They could use lozenges, they could use hot water, turmeric, all of those sometimes help. Distracting, music therapy, acupressure helps. But again, the other things which we have noticed that helps in cough is opioids, again, low dose. We are not, in Bombay at least, we don't get codeine very often, but dextromethorphan or codeine is again very useful in cough. And the other important recent medication we have noticed which helps in cough is gabapentin. Very, very important. Gabapentin, again, you try it only in the night first, see if the patient is able to sleep and therefore the cough goes. And we give up to 300 to 600 milligrams in a day to decrease the cough. So you can use gabapentin, you can use opioids, and if you feel it is psychogenic cough, you could use the benzodiazepines and citalopram, which is also an SSRI. So depending on what the etiology of the cough is, you first start with simple non-pharmacological things. Then you can start more codeine. Then you can go to morphine. Then you can try gabapentin. And if you feel there's a psychogenic effect to it, then you must add the diazepine family or the SSRI. So the doses are given here. Again, this will be shared with you. So it's not a problem, and you can identify if it's a drug induced cough. Then you ideally need to stop the ACE, which is the commonest drug that causes cough, and then include naclofen to just suppress the cough. So this Rajalakshmi can share it with you. I'll just like to touch on the pleural palliative aspects of pleural effusion. Again, very often we see it as a distressing, recurrently filling malignant pleural effusion that can cause both breathlessness and debilitation to the patient because patient is constantly feeling heavy and there is cough. So what we usually do is it all depends on the prognosis of the patient. So if the patient has a good prognosis, then we can put in a long indwelling catheter which can remain in the chest for a long period of time. Attempt that the pleural surfaces get completely dry, and you can do a talc slurry to fuse the two surfaces of the pleura. But if the patient doesn't have a long prognosis, for example, his ECOG scale is low, his performance status is low, or he has some other complications, a lot of comorbidities, and if the patient is not going to survive for more than 4 weeks, then we just drain it one time or aspirate it and leave it. Or you can put even an ICD in the first drain and leave it. It should not be a pigtail where the patient it constantly drains over a long period of time. Now, recurrently filling pleural effusions, we do put a long-term indwelling catheter. So we must remember that patients who are going to live longer, we need to address their quality of life and therefore see to it that they don't keep coming back to the hospital for aspiration. And that all becomes very, very difficult, especially in COVID times, for patients to even report to the hospital. So we can manage patients with good prognosis with a long dwelling intercostal drainage. So this is exactly what I was saying, that it depends on the cause, and if it's malignant effusions, it is difficult to manage. And it also depends on the performance status of the patient, the severity, and you need to drain according to the amount of time you think the patient is going to survive. Then hemoptysis, again, a very scary thing to happen. Happens very often with post-TB sequelae, any infection. And it's important because patients do die of hemoptysis, and they do not, the common reason for death due to hemoptysis is not because of loss of blood, but also because patients drown in their own secretions. They aspirate the blood, and that's the commonest cause of death, especially if there's a large bout of blood that comes out. So there are many interventions available which you should probably be aware of, especially in a palliative care setting. There is bronchial artery embolization done by radiologists, or endoscopically you can put adrenaline. Endoscopically, you can do tranexamic acid, and these days they use laser, cryo, and see to it that at least the patient is not suffering recurrent hemoptysis. But of course, these are the patients who survive the large bout of hemoptysis and get to a hospital. And obviously, small amounts of hemoptysis, you can also do radiotherapy in order that the patient doesn't suffer the distressing symptom. So again, how you speak to the patient is important. Very often, the first things that come to us is, don't worry, nothing will happen. It's very difficult to not be worried when you have a patient who's throwing out red blood outside. So it's very, very important to reassure the patient, give him the anticoagulants, and in this case, we use tranexamic acid, and we also can use adrenaline endobronchoscopically as well as laser and cryo, which is done by interventional pulmonologists. The last symptom is, of course, hiccups, which could be also probably due to a gastric thing. So I'm just going to, you can just run past this. You know, the commonest cause is acidity, and how we can treat hiccups is by simple gastric, reducing gastric distension, use prokinetics and PPIs, or you could also use dopamine agonists like metoclopramide, and worst case scenarios, of course, haloperidol, midazolam, but we could use all these other things. And I remember in residency days, we used to also do a Ryle's tube and give the patient bicarb to neutralize the acid. So sorry, I've overshot the time, and I'm happy to take on the case. It's already 4 o'clock. Any questions? I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, if there are any questions, please ask.
So maybe we should go to the case.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes.
Ma'am, I am Dr. Savitri. My son is 7 years old. After playing, or around 8:30 something night, he used to take some noisy breathing, like a deep breath. His accessory muscles will be acting. On auscultation, it's like a conducting sound only. There is no wheeze, no craps. So dry cough will be there, ma'am. So is it any worrying thing?
So it's difficult to say, but you know, kids can have adenoids. Is there any family history of asthma? Could be cough variant asthma also.
Okay, ma'am.
And it could be dust allergy. It could be a post-nasal drip. And we have also seen a lot of kids with the reflux.
Okay.
So it's best to be evaluated by a pediatrician, but there are multiple reasons for cough.
Yeah, ma'am. I have shown him to the pediatrician also. The upper respiratory, we are putting the drops, oxymetazoline drops, but still now also he is doing the same thing.
Have you done a PFT? Is there a family history of asthma? It could be cough variant asthma.
Okay, ma'am. That part we will do.
Yeah. PFT 8-year-olds can do.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Okay, I think we will move on to patient story. The dose given in the slide was for oral or intravenous. So I think Dr. Nilima was asking about morphine.
No, I think.
Given, yeah.
Was it morphine?
Yeah, I think that's about. Dr. Nilima, was it about morphine?
No, actually it was tranexamic acid. It was mentioned 1.5 grams. I just want to know if it's oral or intravenous.
So if it's massive hemoptysis, it's intravenous, 1.5.
And if it's orally, how much will it be? Is it the same
So you-
dosage orally?
No,
What-
we basically see at the oral dose available. We can it might in a massive hemoptysis. We do not
You
advise.
can't give, exactly, you can't give orally.
So
Right.
therefore, it is usually IV for massive. And when it's when the talk is more on the palliative approach, it's usually thought to be a massive hemoptysis. Small doses of small amount of hemoptysis we manage orally with the regular doses. This is I 1.5 was or IV dose for massive hemoptysis.
Okay. Ma'am, orally, how much do you give? If
So
it's
we
a
give
small-
the patient twice or thrice a day, and we give approximately about 1 tablet thrice a day, which is I think 500 milligrams if I'm not mistaken. But I'll get back to you about that because it's not very. I can't remember the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
500 to 1 gram TID can be given.
Yeah, I think it is 500 is what we give three times a day.
Yeah, intravenous also is about the same, like wow.
Yeah,
1,000.
correct. But
That's what I
only
want
then
to know if it's
intravenous we
equivalent
give
dose.
bolus, na? We give
Yeah.
endobronchially also we can give adrenaline or acid.
Ma'am, both
we
can
give.
be given. Even
Correct. Correct.
as an infusion can be given.
Correct.
When do you say it's massive hemoptysis? Any quantity you?
No. So anything, for example, to be honest with you, streaky hemoptysis, and small clots is, medium to moderate. Anything larger than that, see, it also depends on the way the patient describes it. See, you might not be witness to the hemoptysis. So any large quantity of blood which is coughed at once is massive because that can cause aspiration, because even a small amount can lead to aspiration and death.
Thank you.
So Rajalakshmi, I think we will move on to patient story, which will be presented by Dr. Sukriti. So Dr. Sukriti.
Can I share? Okay.
Doctor, if you want, you can share.
Okay. At the moment, I don't have access to the share screen feature. So either you could share it, or if you could give me access, I'll share it.
You have the access, ma'am. Can you check it again?
Okay, let me check. Okay, got it. So at the outset, I just like to say that while making this presentation, I probably didn't have a good grip on breathlessness, especially in the context of palliative care. But Dr. Iyer gave a fantastic session today, which I really enjoyed, talking about breathlessness and being someone who's just finished MBBS and being very low in the level of training as compared to everybody here, it was truly eye-opening. So thank you, Dr. Iyer.
Thank you very much.
I
wish I had started as early as you have to your journey into palliative care. So I'm sure you'll go places having started this young.
So I'll start my presentation.
Sure.
So this was a case that I saw a while ago, and apologies if I don't have all the details and the intricacies, but I feel like after the session, it will be a great way to just recap what Dr. Iyer taught us today. And so this was a 54-year-old woman that we saw who was diagnosed with small cell lung cancer. She came in with presenting complaints of worsening dyspnea at rest from 3 to 4 weeks, along with an intermittently productive cough, fatigue, and poor appetite. So she had a history of small cell lung cancer, which was diagnosed 10 months ago. She had an excellent response to treatment, which included chemotherapy. And so consistent with her diagnosis, small cell lung cancer, she was also a chronic smoker.
So when she came in, she was alert, but she was in an acute dyspnea crisis, and she had to be supported with oxygen. She was also in pain. Her other vital signs seemed to be stable, like her blood pressure and pulse. And her respiratory exam revealed this upper lung pathology, evidenced by reduced chest expansion and vesicular breath sounds. Her supraclavicular nodes were also palpable, and review of the other systems was largely unremarkable. So she was evaluated in the ward, and we found that her complete blood count showed she had a normocytic anemia with normal WBCs and platelets. So before I drone on about just her investigations, I'd like to say that breathlessness in a patient with lung cancer, though it may seem very though it may seem very easy, the diagnostic challenge is great, because breathlessness in a cancer patient could be because of a direct tumor effect, or it could be as a result of the cancer. As we saw, there could be a result of a pleural effusion. And we should also remember that cancer is essentially a hypercoagulable state. So these patients are also at high risk for things like pulmonary embolism. And generally, when I see a patient with dyspnea, I remember something called the dyspnea pyramid, which is essentially the bottom of the pyramid, which is the chunk of the pyramid is usually of cardiopulmonary cause. And then you have the top half of the pyramid, which is say 5%, and the bottom is 95 if we distribute it such. The top half is usually due to something like acidosis or anemia, or it could be due to a neuromuscular disorder, and finally something psychogenic like anxiety or a panic attack could also cause dyspnea. So when you're conducting an investigation in a cancer patient, it's important to focus on the vitals, because they really help you divide into whether this is a worrisome breathlessness, or whether it's something more benign like a anxiety or a panic attack, or just distress or anemia. So that's something that I'd like to highlight over here. And then so as I continue with my presentation, we found that she had normocytic anemia. And something also that you need to remember about cancer is that it's a state of immunocompromise. So these patients are also prone to a lot of infections, respiratory infections, which is why this normal WBC count here was reassuring. Her chemistry showed normal electrolytes, slight elevation of serum urea and creatinine. The liver function tests were normal. And as Dr. Iyer touched upon the investigations, the blood gas here showed a type 1 respiratory failure, which is essentially a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen versus the type 2. So this showed that the pathology was in the lungs, and this was consistent with our examination, where the other systems were largely unremarkable, and we found the pathology was more in the lung. So this essentially confirmed our hypothesis that there was something in the lung. And then so imaging was a pivot of this case, where it revealed that there was a right upper lobe collapse with loss of pulmonary vascular markings, and a bronchoscopy was performed which showed the presence of a mass in the right main bronchus measuring 5 into 3 centimeters. This mass was biopsied and confirmed to be a small cell lung cancer. So what we were dealing with here was a recurrence essentially. So touching upon some of the psychosocial aspects, which was something that I hadn't thought about when I saw this patient. And now retrospectively, this makes sense that this patient was from a low income household. And apart from just her physical symptoms, she felt a sense of dependence on her children, because she wasn't able to to do her daily activities. She also felt some regret on not being able to quit smoking earlier, and so retrospectively these should have played a bigger part in our treatment plan, but these are good things to know now. So when we admitted her, she was admitted to the respiratory care unit and she was given oxygen supplementation. She was also given intravenous morphine for her pain relief. And then she was planned for palliative combined chemotherapy and radiotherapy. So, as I touched upon, her main concern was her dependency on her children and on her husband for her because she wasn't able to do her daily activities on account of her debilitating breathlessness, and also just the discomfort and pain as a result of her breathlessness. So, in summary, my problem statement would be that she was a middle-aged woman with a history of small cell lung cancer who presented with worsening dyspnea at rest, intermittent cough and fatigue. Labs showed normocytic anemia and type 1 respiratory failure. Imaging was notable for this upper lobe collapse with loss of pulmonary vascular markings and a right mass, and this biopsy revealed recurrence of small cell lung cancer. So these were some of the discussion points, which now essentially are just a recap of Dr. Iyer's class. And so as I touched upon, that the challenge with dealing with breathlessness in cancer is not only in its treatment, which is very complex, but also in its diagnosis. So some of the things that we could think about or talk about is what are the causes of dyspnea in cancer. The others could also be how do we approach dyspnea in palliative care, both from the point of view of symptomatic treatment as well as non-specific treatment. And I think something interesting, although it wasn't touched upon today, that I came across while doing this and researching was what is a dyspnea crisis and how to approach it. And since we all haven't prepared, I just like to say a couple of lines that I found that were interesting. It's an interesting mnemonic just for because in the American Thoracic Society ad hoc committee guidelines, and essentially there is a long drawn out definition of dyspnea crisis, but essentially what it is just sustained and severe resting breathing discomfort, and this is often related to a life-limiting illness that overwhelms the patient and caregiver's ability to achieve symptom relief, and most often it is non-reversible. And a very cool mnemonic that I found that we can all remember. These are things that you can do in response to a dyspnea crisis. And the mnemonic is comfort. C, call for help in a calming voice and approach amongst patient and caregivers. O, observe closely and assess dyspnea for ways to respond. M, medication. Medications to be tried. F, fan. Fan to face may decrease shortness of breath, as Dr. Iyer touched upon. And this, of course, could be done in cases of cancer, but not so much in this COVID era. O, for oxygen. R, for reassure and use relaxation techniques. And finally, T, timing interventions to reduce dyspnea. Work together, reassess, and repeat.
Thank you so much. That was really nice. Where have you done your MBBS from?
I've done it from Bangalore, from Ambedkar College.
And currently, are you doing a post-graduation?
So I'm applying to internal medicine residencies in the US.
Okay. So just to add to your causes of dyspnea, it was really nice that, they did think of morphine to think of a pain. Very often, even in Bombay, we don't see patients getting morphine when they should. But just to complete the whole thing, this lady was too young to die, first of all. So her 54, her children would be very young. That could also worsen her anxiety. The second thing is because she smoked, and she probably came from a lower socioeconomic or higher socioeconomic. I thought I heard lower socioeconomic, which means she probably didn't smoke cigarettes. She smoked BDs. And the problem with BDs, it's unfiltered. So the amount of carcinogens that BD delivers in the lung is way more than what a cigarette delivers, because cigarette is double filtered. So that also can result in what we call as a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So her breathlessness underlying could also be because of the some amount of COPD she has, because cigarette smoke definitely affects the anatomic structure of the lungs. On top of it, she had the tumor, which obviously obstructed a bronchus, and it had probably spread and recurred. So they were all the causes of breathlessness. Plus cancer itself causes anorexia. So they have a lot of anorexia, cachexia, which leads to nutritional deficiencies, which leads to breathlessness. That is one thing, that they could have underlying lung disease, and the age and the fact that she was leaving her children, all that could worsen her breathlessness. The only other thing that I would like to add here is also the fact that in history taking at this level that the young doctor presented, Sukriti, is that we are not trained to go beyond what we see. Are you coping well? Or is your family coping well? What is bothering you? Is there something you want to talk about, and leave it at that? So open-ended questions to explore the fears, because sometimes we have seen patients who come up with the most bizarre things when you discuss about their fears and values. It could be something really weird. For example, a teacher of mine always said that whenever I talk to a patient of mine or a classmate of mine who was diagnosed with breast cancer, the thing she was worried about was losing her hair because of the chemotherapy. So people could be different. We need to not assume what they're worried about, and therefore importantly explore. So if you have a palliative care hat on, it's very interesting to see what all things people come up with, because it takes all sorts to make this world. And the last thing, of course, difference that I would say between what I have seen in interestingly in palliative care is when you diagnose a patient with cancer, automatically the patient has an emotional connect with death, and the patient starts thinking of, oh, my time starts now. But when you diagnose a patient with COPD or ILD or congestive cardiac failure, non-cancer diagnosis is not perceived as life limiting. So unless the doctor is trained to talk about death and dying, and unless the doctor kind of picks up this patient is on a slippery slide down, the patient also thinks, "Main theek ho jaunga, I will be fine, the doctor is treating me." So the discussion of non-cancer palliative needs to be integrated in all specialties. That is my humble request. And I think we are very much over time. But any last minute thoughts or thank you very much, Sukriti. You did a great job. And comfort, I will remember.
Yeah. Anybody has any more questions regarding this patient story or regarding the session?
What to do in the absence of morphine?
In absence of morphine, yeah.
So there are non-pharmacological things you can do. Unfortunately, yes. First thing to do in the absence of morphine is to contact Pallium India, because Pallium India knows of how to get your morphine license for the particular hospital you work. Very, very important, because the rules have changed with the NDPS Act of 2014, and not many hospitals are aware of it. And it's not that difficult to get your license to get the morphine. And now that you have trained in palliative care, your hospital can get the morphine under your training and under your name. So please get that sorted. The other thing that you can use is, again, is patches. So the semi-synthetic opioid patches that are available can be used with caution. One, in a tropical country, because of sweat, you cannot ensure the doses of morphine circulating are enough. And two, it's expensive, but you can use more. You can use patches. And the other thing, again, I suppose, if you do not have morphine, is to use methadone, but even more difficult to give doses. Sunil is the champion for methadone, but that also can be used in breathlessness. But ideally, morphine is the best, and please procure it for all your hospitals. Anything else?
So, madam, can you talk about the use of handheld fan in breathlessness? I think that would be...
handheld fan, there is a lot of trials done with handheld fan. where there's a small fan blowing into the face of the person who is breathless. And typically it is, there are the results, the research shows that it gives a sense of relief of breathlessness. Again, I would like to caution, during COVID times, it is also supposed to be spreading the virus. So it is not supposed to be very ideal in COVID times. But if you're sure the patient is COVID negative or the patient is at home, then the breathless, even you yourself, when you're very hot or you're in a stuffy room, you yourself feel better when you open the window or loosen your clothes and sit with a handheld fan or even just a paper. So that is what the sensation is. For patients, it is proven to be statistically significant of how better they feel with the handheld fan. You want to add anything about it? Because I think Savitri said, how about COVID reinfection? So that's why in COVID it is difficult. What is the meaning of COVID reinfection? I didn't get that question. Is it with respect to handheld fan, or is it with people getting
No,
COVID again?
not related to the fan health things. This once now a lot of patients, my relatives also got, infected with COVID. They are doing well, ma'am. Now it means they are on the course of treatment, but they are quite well. But there is a chance for reinfection also now, ma'am.
Yes.
So how much time it will take for that? Any time duration is there, or
no, there's no thing. It depends on how kept. So basically, even
immunity?
if you've got infected once, you can't afford to be complacent. You can always get it again. It's like a normal flu. We get flu so often in our life, na? So COVID can come back again. The antibodies, I think, roughly remain for about 2 to 3 months, but we can't afford to put a guard down.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to add something to the handheld
Sure.
fan, which I saw in the literature. So there were two studies. One was patient was just given a handheld fan and asked to asked to show to the face the blow of air. And another group, they have told what is the use of this handheld fan and what will it do to your breathlessness. So they have explained it beautifully to the patient. So they found that the patients whom they have explained in detail, they have reduced breathlessness. So there is a randomized control trial also regarding handheld fan. It should be placed 15 centimeter from the face. So that's about.
I also feel, Sunil, in that it could be the communication also that did the wonder, because that is a very important skill that doctors, it's like a procedure. The more you talk, the way you talk, the effectiveness of the talking makes a huge difference on the patient's IQ. That's another thing that's not taught to us in the mid school.
Yeah.
So I think Uma has asked about steroids in terminal breathlessness. To decrease breathlessness, no. Steroids is an anti-inflammatory, yes. So if you feel there's a strong cause of breathlessness because, say, suppose the tumor is on the main bronchus and the edema can cause, then yes. But it doesn't cause anything to the breathlessness. It's probably an anti-inflammatory role which can be used. So terminal breathlessness is unlikely to be steroids unless there is a pressure or an inflammatory response that you want from, like, say, severe COPD, airways are tight, you can use steroids. But other than that, there is no.
Any more questions? Okay, we have had many questions on COVID and respiratory problems. So for your information, we are conducting an echo on COVID, which is known as Pali-COVID echo. So we do it in every week in English 1 week, and the next week will be in Hindi. So for those who are interested, please contact Rajalakshmi or Arun. So they can help you to enroll you in that echo. But I think the timing would be difficult because it is also from 3 to 4:15. So that would be one problem. But you can always see whether it will work for you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed, as always, having these sessions, but it's really nice that all of you participated and interacted. I think it makes that more interesting, and it's nice that you interrupted. That is the best part. So I appreciate you and thank you very much, and good luck to Sukriti for her future. I think probably she's the youngest in this lot. But anyway, good luck to you, and lovely to see a young face already doing palliative care. So all the best to everybody, and hopefully we meet somewhere sometime. I'm not sure, but thank you very much, Pallium, for giving me this chance. Arun, Sunil, and Rajalakshmi, thank you so much.
So thank you, madam, and thank you, Dr. Sukriti, for your wonderful presentations. And thank you all.
Sukriti, just share the comfort also with Rajalakshmi, so she'll send it to me, please.
Yeah, I will share it. I have an article on that.
Great, please do. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. We have shared the feedback link. Give it a minute, do it, then only leave the meeting. Can see you Thursday with a topic on wound management taken by Sister Shiva. Thank you all. See you on Thursday. Bye.